Nice to see so many of us from both the YU and the TFS community. Welcome to everyone. Hello to all of you joining us. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in Canada and elsewhere. Okay, great. So what I might do is we might just get started. I know a lot of people are coming in and trickling in. I know Hart's mentioning he's got some of his family as well.
Yeah, I noticed. Awesome. Hi, everyone, and hi to some family members that have checked in.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you everybody for joining us. We'll get started. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn Standing Together Against Hate. I'm really super proud and privileged to be able to be hosting this discussion with our amazing panelists from both our Toronto Film School and Yorkville University community. And I'm just gonna get started with an Indigenous land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge that Yorkville University and Toronto Film School campuses are situated in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous nations. We reaffirm our responsibility to increase awareness and understanding of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and colonial legacy, and commit to strengthening our relationship with Indigenous peoples throughout Canada. Just to give you a heads up as well to all participants and attendees, this is being both recorded and live streamed, and they'll certainly be uploaded on YouTube later on. You're more than welcome to use the chat if you have any comments. I would just ask that we please keep the comments and discussion respectful, especially given today's topic. And you can also submit any questions that you might have in the Q&A, and we'll have some time, hopefully near the end, to get to those as well. Today's topic is also quite sensitive, and I do want to give a content warning here. Our discussion today will revolve around subject matter and content that some viewers might find triggering. Those discussion topics may include violence, psychological trauma, mention of anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. So we highly recommend viewer discretion and self-care as you see fit and appropriate. Students can also access free confidential mental health support at the following links for JNAP, and I know our wonderful communication support staff member Yazan is going to be dropping those in the chat. And in terms of employees, they can also access LifeWorks online at the link in the chat, or the EAP support line, which is also there as well. I just want to highlight our amazing panelists for today's event. We have joining us Hart Massey, who's the TFS Program Director of Acting. He's worked as an actor, writer, and director and producer in the theater and film industry for over 30 years. He's had a number of hit TV shows like Heart of the Annex and The Film Student, which were acclaimed on Rogers TV and led to nominations at the Rogers Impressions Award and Gemini Awards. He's also an alumni of U of T's drama program and the Berlin Male Talent Campus. His films have played in international film festivals such as the Berlin and Montreal World Film Festivals and the Seattle Independent Festival, and also TIFF's Rockets Film Festival as well. He's been able to work alongside amazing, talented directors and entertainers like Ryan Reynolds, Thompson Highway, and Tara Strong. And in 2010, he became the program director for the acting program at TFS, and he co-authored the Complete Actor Training Curriculum.
Thanks, Tamina.
Thank you. And we have Andrew Chung joining us, who is the TFS film production faculty member. And he's a writer and director based in Toronto. His films like Ma, Love Bites, and White Elephant have been broadcast on Air Canada, CBC, the Super Channel. His web series Millions won him Best Director at the Marseille Web Fest in France. And his short film Ma won Best Short at the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. And his feature film White Elephant won Best Feature, Best Director, and Best Writer at the Real World Film Festival, Best Canadian Feature, and Best Overall Performance at the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, and Best Ensemble and Best Set Design at the Canadian Film Festival. He has also co-founded the Asian Canadian Film Alliance, which is a community advocacy group dedicated to championing Asian Canadian voices in film, and is a board member of the Racial Equity Screen Office. So thank you so much to Andrew for joining us as well. And we have Sura Al-Mansour joining us, who is a YU BBA student and also a member of our Student Diversity Advisory Council as well. In addition to being a BBA student at YU, she studies part-time while working full-time in the business industry. She's always been an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Apart from being an active member on our Diversity Advisory Council, she's also volunteered for a number of different initiatives in the Ottawa community, including the Southeast Ottawa Community Health Center and being a member of the Muslim Student Association at Algonquin College. She's a proud Muslim Canadian who is active in the Ottawa community. She's a board member with her mother's charity, which is a nonprofit supporting Iraqi orphans and disadvantaged children, and it's called Basmat Yatim. Aside from her volunteering, she's an active learner and is often participating in a lot of different events, including events of the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, the An-Nisa Organization of Canada, Canadian Muslim Lawyers Association, EY Muslim Community, and the Muslim Women Professionals. So thank you so much to all of our esteemed panelists for joining us and for really providing us with insight into their lived experience around our topic for today, which really is focused on anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. So this event we are hosting in honor of May being both Asian Heritage Month and Jewish Heritage Month as well. And so I kind of want to set the context around why we're doing this. In today's event, we're going to be really looking at the themes of hate, prejudice, stereotypes, bias against different equity-seeking groups, which can often start from the level of microaggression and unfortunately make its way to serious hate crimes. We're going to be hearing from the lived experiences of Andrew and Hart and Sura around anti-Asian racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. And we're going to really be able to have the privilege of listening to what does this actually feel like, and what is the negative impact of these isms on inclusion and belonging within Canada, and how we as diverse communities can come together as a united front to address hate in our society. I also just want to set the context of what's been going on. I know there's been a lot of unfortunate incidents that, for example, from the onset of the pandemic, we saw a lot of unfortunate and racist assaults on people of Asian origin, especially elderly Asian community members of ours as well, and really brazen attacks on public transit or other public spaces. In addition to that, in the past couple of months, we've seen an increase in anti-Semitic vandalism, really frighteningly at schools, at public schools here in Toronto, high schools and elementary schools. And we've also seen an increase, unfortunately, in Canada and here as well in the Greater Toronto area around Islamophobia and attacks on mosques as well, and assaults on people going to places of worship. I just want to actually define what these terms mean before we actually jump into our conversation, just sort of setting the context around what anti-Asian racism refers to. So the government of Canada does actually define anti-Asian racism as historical and ongoing discrimination, negative stereotyping, and injustice experienced by people of Asian heritage. And this is really based on other people's assumption about their ethnicity and nationality. People of Asian heritage are subjected to specific overt and subtle racist tropes at individual and systemic levels, which leads to their ongoing social, economic, political, and cultural marginalization and disadvantage and unequal treatment. And this is really seen in a lot of these racist perceptions around being a yellow peril or a perpetual foreigner, a model minority, exotic, or mystic. And the government's definition goes on to really root this in Canada's long history of racist and exclusionary laws, whether that was laws like the Chinese head tax or the very racist internment of Japanese Canadians as well. And that has often masked racism faced by people of Asian heritage while erasing their historical contributions to building Canada. I also just want to point out that their definition very much looks at the fact that the term Asian itself encompasses a wide range of identities, and that the very term can actually obscure that diversity as well. While all may experience being otherized, specific experiences of anti-Asian racism may vary. Some may be perceived to be a threat, others face gendered exotification and violence, and some might be likely to be subjected to online hate and racist portrayals in the media. And while others might actually face intersecting forms of hate like Islamophobia and other religious-based discrimination. Anti-Semitism, if we're looking at the very general definition in the dictionary, is very much summed up as hostility toward or discrimination against Jewish peoples as a religious, ethnic, or racial group. And the government of Canada in its anti-racism strategy has actually adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition, which really focuses on the perception being expressed as hatred towards Jewish peoples, whether that's through rhetoric or physical manifestation of anti-Semitism that's directed towards both Jewish and non-Jewish people and their property, community institutions, and religious facilities. And lastly, Islamophobia, as per the government's anti-racism strategy, is defined as racism, stereotypes, prejudice, fear, or acts of hostility directed towards individual Muslims or followers of Islam in general, in addition to individual acts of intolerance and racial profiling. It can lead to viewing and treating Muslims as a greater security threat on an institutional, systemic, and societal level. And just before we get into our discussion, I want to set the socio-legal context of this as well. Being Canadians, it is very much a part of the fabric of our legal and social identity that we are lucky and privileged to have pieces of legislation like the Charter and both federal and provincial human rights legislation, which prohibits discrimination and which does guarantee that equality before the law and the protection of the law without discrimination on the basis of any number of grounds, whether that's race or ethnicity or religion, and so on and so forth. And the Criminal Code of Canada relates to this because there are provisions around hate propaganda, whether that's advocating genocide, public incitement of hatred, or willful promotion of hatred. And this also includes hate-motivated and bias-motivated crime. Just want to quickly get into some stats from Statistics Canada, which really highlights the importance of why we're having this discussion today. Anti-Asian racism increased basically the number of police reported hate crimes increased 37% in 2020 with the onset of the pandemic. And this was largely related to incidents targeting race or ethnicity. And as you can see by the graph below, the relative risk of ethnic or racial discrimination increased most amongst Asian groups, and the Chinese population was 10 times more likely to report being a victim of ethnic or racial discrimination. This is a really great infographic because it really highlights exactly who has been targeted when it comes to anti-Asian racism. We see that the vast majority are of East Asian origin. Unfortunately, these brazen assaults are happening in public spaces. And we can see that Vancouver and Toronto have the most prevalence of these unfortunate incidents. And similarly with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in 2020, 20% of hate crimes were motivated by religion. And we saw an increase towards the Jewish community, then followed by Muslim communities as well. So I'm actually going to stop sharing now, and then just going to jump right into some of the questions for our amazing panelists. And my first question is actually for Andrew. This is really around the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that it was very abundantly clear when we were seeing these horrific acts of violence taking place here in Canada and around the world, and a lot of the really racist narrative around COVID, and the fact that people of Asian origin were being scapegoated as the cause of the virus. I wanted to hand the mic over to you to learn more about whether there were any such instances that you've experienced in your own life, and whether you can also help us understand some of the intersectional aspects of that.
Yeah, of course. First, I just want to thank everybody for coming today. There's a lot of you, and of course, it's a difficult conversation for us to have. But I think hopefully this garners some empathy around all our communities coming together. But yeah, in regards to your question, I think thankfully for the most part, I've been able to not experience anything very serious, but. I did experience one near the beginning of the pandemic, and I think the reason why I escaped a lot of like serious incidents is because it did the one incident that happened right when the pandemic hit, like kind of gave us a lot of anxiety, and I just I didn't feel very comfortable being in public, right? So that kind of maybe that was the reason why I never experienced a serious incident since. But soon after the pandemic hit, like the first experience I had was my wife was pregnant at the time, and we just went for a walk because we were doing our daily walks. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, I think like everybody else, like we were staying indoors most of the time, and we just try to get air during the day as much as possible. So, we were just walking. We live in Leslieville, the east end of Toronto, and we were just going for a walk on the street. And then I had been speaking to my wife, and I hadn't been watching the sidewalk in front of me. And then a lady approached, and I hadn't seen her. And then she blatantly said, like, "Can you get out of the way?" Right? It was very narrow sidewalk, if you know downtown neighborhoods, and so there wasn't a lot of room for us to move. And plus, my wife is pregnant, right? And neither of us had seen her coming, and then we were just so like shocked by her brazen, attitude. And then so I told her, like, we didn't see you, and there's not much space on the sidewalk, and my wife is pregnant. She can't move. She's not spry, of course, because she's pregnant. And that just led to an argument between us, like on the street, right? Because I had not taken her rudeness well, right? And I felt very protective of my wife as well, right? So we got into a spat, and then at the same time there was like a woman on a cyclist that was just passing by, and I had been conversing with the woman that had been rude to us, and I said to her, like, "Where did you expect us to walk? Right? There's no space on the sidewalk, right?" And then she blatantly said, "On the road." And then so when a cyclist was passing and overheard the conversation, she just yelled out loud, "Yeah, on the road." So I'm like, and this is somebody who had nothing to do with the incident between us. So it just felt like we just felt very othered in that situation, where like we didn't belong in our own neighborhood, and that we had to accommodate those around us. And there was no blatant racial slurs being made, but we felt we understood what was happening, right? Like, and why the cyclist on the road, who was also white, of course there was something deeper going on there. This is the pandemic had just hit, and everybody was very angry. There was a lot of hostility, and people were looking for a scapegoat. And the East Asian community was it, right? Because the virus had originated in China. So we weren't naive to the fact that this incident was just some random lady who was just angry. We attributed it to the fact that we were of East Asian descent. So and it was very upsetting. Like, my wife was very upset, right? So after that, she did not want to go on walks anymore, right? So it was very traumatic for her, especially, being pregnant as well. She, you'd expect a lot more empathy, but we weren't getting it. And so after that incident, we were much more calculating in whenever we went outdoors, right? We'd purposely not go certain places. And of course that affected our lives,
Right.
So even these smaller incidents, they do have effect on our personal comfortability in our own neighborhoods, right? And our neighborhood also suffers from gentrification. So
Right.
This neighborhood used to have a large immigrant population, and it no longer does. We've been, the housing prices have been going up, and immigrant populations have been driven out. And my wife grew up here, and she's noticed those changes as well. So it just, over time, over the years, it just feels like we don't belong here anymore, right? And incidents like that make us feel like that even more strongly, right? But that was the most personal experience I've had of anti-Asian racism. Of course, we've always experienced it on with microaggressions professionally as well. And yeah, it's just something we've had to navigate. I think because the Asian community has, for a long time, we've, probably arguably have escaped like blatant racism because we've been perceived as, white adjacent, and I think the fact that we became the scapegoat for this pandemic kind of shows that, like, hate doesn't escape any community, right?
Absolutely.
We're all experiencing it to some extent, and I think that's why empathy is so important amongst all our communities. Because this is also not to say that victims of anti-Asian racism, it's the perpetrators aren't just white, right?
Absolutely.
One of my wife's colleagues, like, she's Filipino, and she was punched in a park, like, during the pandemic, like, just randomly, because she was of Asian descent, and she's Southeast Asian, and she's not Chinese, and the person who had punched her was not white, right? So hate and bias, like, we're all susceptible to it. So
Right.
I think
Right.
finding an understanding amongst all communities, right?
Absolutely. It knows no color and no boundaries, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I think one of the things I took away from your experience is that you then began to self-regulate and self-isolate, not just because of, COVID is one thing, but because of the anti-Asian racism. And so I can't imagine what kind of a negative, profoundly negative impact that also has on you and on your wife, who, as you said, was pregnant and was already going, through a lot of changes. So thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing. And I know we have some great comments in the chat as well, from Ismail around what leads to hate and prejudice as well. I'm going to direct the second question to Hart. This is really very much around anti-Semitism being a complex form of hate, because on the one hand, people are just kind of looking at the color of your skin and kind of, joining that with the fact that, well, you can pass as white, or you have white privilege. But on the other hand, we're well aware of the deep global history of anti-Semitic rhetoric and genocide and the very dangerous consequences of that form of hate. Can you help us understand your experience as someone who identifies as being Jewish and the nuances around belonging?
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tamina, for having me join you for this, and I'm sorry to hear that story, Andrew. It's sort of hard to believe that we're having these conversations growing up in a country like Canada, where I was certainly privileged in the sense that my family was always very open to us having relationships and friendships and marriages with people of all types and all race, and that's been a blessing in a lot of ways, because I always sought to look beyond just my own identity and my own cultural background, and it's been very helpful in getting to know other people. And I think these kinds of conversations are so critical for us to get beyond what Ismail was writing in there about the ignorance that's going on in the world today.
Right.
I think it's a very, when you talk about being Jewish, it's a very complicated situation, because on the one hand, we're seen as this culture of white people that are in some ways have been very, seen as very successful and financially successful. And I think that stereotype, goes across the culture, the religion, and not everybody lives like that. We're not all blessed to be financially wealthy and successful. I certainly didn't grow up that way. But what's interesting about being Jewish is that while you do have white skin, underneath it, you're different, and you're unfortunately, because of our past, you're always, it's well known to us. Our stories are told at religious holidays like Passover Seder about, the persecution that has gone on for thousands and thousands of years. And of course, the Holocaust was not that long ago. So while it's perceived that we're doing all right and that we're maybe become what's perceived as the oppressor in that sense, because of the success, the reality is that there's always a feeling that you don't know what's going to happen or how the world's opinion is going to change. And we're seeing it happen, a lot at this period of time. And I felt always growing up that I didn't really want people to know I was Jewish. A story that I've heard from a lot of people who are Jewish. You don't really want to be identified as such, because you don't know what the other person's going to think. Right. And you don't know if they're going to have anti-Semitic feelings. You don't know if their opinions of you will change, because they know that about you. They approach you one way because they see you a certain way, but then when they hear that, is that going to impact the way that they treat you? And certainly, I mean, I still feel it to this day, unbelievably. And, it's like, what's interesting is that I heard the same story when there was a webinar hosted about some of our Black educators at YU, and they spoke about, one of them spoke about how they're always asked, where are you from? Right. They found that to be something that was offensive in a way. I personally have never found it offensive, but I've been asked that forever, and I don't think it's because I'm Jewish. It's because I have black hair, or I have darker complexion, right? But I was speaking about it with my wife last night, and she was saying, I've never been asked that, because she identifies as white, and so as a result, it doesn't have, that doesn't happen to her, but it happens to me, and it happens to others like me. And it's, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss these things and to have the chance to really open up about lived experiences. But I do get it from the perspective that some people feel like that means they're not a part of this culture, this Canadian identity. And, I never really truly experienced racism until I started working in restaurants. I was a young actor. I was just, my late teens and just getting into university and just on the verge of really opening my eyes to the rest of the world. And I worked in an Italian restaurant in a Jewish neighborhood. I was the only Jewish person working there. And I was in the back room. I think I was bussing at the time. I may have been bussing or waitering. I can't remember. I was trying to work my way up, I know. Right. And I had this conversation with a chef who was an older man of Italian descent. And he pulled me aside and he said, can I speak to you? I said, sure. And he said, Hitler was a very good man. And I remember looking at him just appalled, but at the same time staring at this very ignorant man. Right. Me. And even though I was only about 18 and he was probably about in his late 50s, I don't know what came out, the courage to come up and say something, but I just retorted. I said, Hitler was very bad for the Germans. And he was also extremely bad for the Italians. I had a bit of knowledge of the history, I guess, of the relationship between Italy and Germany at the time, and the fact that they were allied and what that did to Italy as a country. And just to preface that, many Italians have said, you know, they were sort of shocked that all of a sudden they were supposed to be anti-Semitic back then. But he made this comment, and I know why he made this comment. He made this comment because he was frustrated by his working experience. He was frustrated at the fact that he was working, you know, he was a chef in a restaurant where the predominant customer was Jewish. And, you know, you get frustrated when people criticize your work or whatnot. But that never should have come out, particularly to an 18-year-old boy who's just learning his way in the world. And, you know, I walked away, and then I remember him pulling me back. I don't know if it was the same day or another day. And he said to me, you know, you're right. Hitler was bad for the Italians. And I just, you know, you sort of just had to laugh, but it's sort of the ignorance of it, because he recognized that it was a stupid comment that was made to offend out of his own frustrations. But this is what, you know, as a Jewish person you go through, and you don't know what people feel. And there's a great, you know, and then there's a feeling that, and I know, like, just knowing my mother was an immigrant, and so many Jewish people were immigrants, but there's a great book by Mordechai Richler, The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, and it's you know, well read, and it's really about Jews that are immigrants in Montreal and where they come from, and how that second generation Jewish person, there's a character in the story, and he's just desperate to be accepted by the Anglos. He gets into some sort of fraternity, and he's so proud of himself and how he's a Jew, but he's sort of he's secretly not having to show himself as a Jew, and while being accepted. And I think that this is something that a lot of second generation immigrants feel when they're in Canada. And I'm hoping these kinds of conversations will, you know, get us away from that and recognize that we're all the same. You know, at the end of the day, we're all human beings that love, hate, have jealousy, have anger, have passion, and all that. So anyway, I hope that.
Thank you so much, Hart. And I think I'm still seeing that same theme from what Andrew was saying, that you then have to decide whether there's parts of your identity you will show or you will not show. And I know that for people within the Jewish community, that might come out in a number of ways, whether or not you actually, you know, visibly wear any articles of faith, or, as I think we were talking about before, you know, you mentioning that you don't eat pork, and then that somehow becomes an issue too, right? Or somebody picks up on that. It was something that, you know, I don't fault my sister-in-law, no. But I remember going out for dinner recently, and she had some friends there and said, "Oh, Hart doesn't eat pork, you know, because he's Jewish." And I never, you know, it always makes me kind of somewhat cringe, not knowing what how they're going to feel, you know? Right, absolutely. And where that's going to go. And so I can definitely see that, you know, for all communities, there is that sense of fear as to where is this going to go? Is it going to be violence? Is it going to be, you know, something less than that, but just more microaggressions? So thank you so much, Hart, for sharing that. I want to move on to Sura. And I know people are commenting on the, Glenda's commenting on the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz as well. And it's just really interesting to see that in our Canadian literature, there's a lot of those exploration of belonging and identity. So Sura, I wanted to talk to you more about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment. Obviously, we're seeing that that's on the rise in Canada as well, with mosques unfortunately being vandalized. You know, visibly Muslim women who wear the hijab or the niqab are often targets of violence. And unfortunately, we are coming up on the very sad one-year anniversary of the tragic London anti-Muslim hate attack, which murdered the Afzal family. So in your experience, what are some of the common microaggressions targeting Muslims, which can normalize these attitudes and very well lead to the point of violence?
Thank you so much for having me, Tamina, and Andrew and Hart. I really appreciated hearing a lot about your stories, and I'm so sorry that you guys had to go through that. Actually, in relation to what Andrew had mentioned, after the family had unfortunately been attacked in London, I can definitely resonate and relate to feeling afraid of going outside or even going for a walk in fear that I too might be run over by a car or hit or targeted just because of the way that I look. And I definitely understand that, as Hart mentioned, sometimes you can't escape the way that you look or what your name is, or it's kind of hard to hide your identity. And I am one that is very proud of my identity, but I can definitely understand a lot of the microaggressions that can come up, definitely, specifically even in the business world. Sometimes you have the comments where you submit a resume and they look at your name, and when they see you, their entire perception changes because of the way that you look, and they say, oh, I didn't expect you to look this way, or your name didn't look the way that you look. And sometimes you think to yourself, well, what does that mean? What is my name supposed to look like if you don't have an ethnic looking name right away, or if you do? But yeah, no, I definitely understand that those microaggressions can come up in that way. Also having like underlying anxiety about people's perception, never wanting to be judged. I did see in the comments, I think Mercedes had mentioned that sometimes it's the most difficult question when someone asks you, but where are you really from? And you're like, I'm from here, I'm from Canada, I grew up here, this is where I'm from, this is all I know. And sometimes it's like, why do people have to ask those questions? Yeah.
Absolutely. Definitely hit it on the head for sure, especially when it comes to the workplace context. I think that's where a lot of this shows up, as Hart was mentioning and you were mentioning, and I know Andrew has mentioned before too, within the creative industries and the perceptions that people have around your identity, and the fact that that really impacts opportunities within the workplace too, whether you are going to get hired, and then once you are hired, whether you are or are not going to be picked for promotions and for going further in your industry. And I think there's a lot of parallels there to both the creative and business spheres as well. So thank you all so much for sharing your lived experience. I think it's been really helpful to get this cross section of experiences and seeing the different themes that are actually quite similar when it comes to fear, anxiety of what's to come and what people's reaction will be and how that impacts your life. One of the questions that I had before we can kind of open it up to the questions from the audience is around, how do you think, now that we know these experiences and that we've been able to hear it from you, how do people of all backgrounds assist in being upstanders and allies in combating hate? Are there some solutions, some that might even be specific to your industry, to help people that are the targets of these attitudes and crimes feel more safe and welcome in Canada? And please feel free to allude to any projects that you may have worked on that's related to this as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a great question. I was thinking about that today, and one of the things that I started doing when I was younger was I wanted to see more representation when I was coming out of acting school, some 20 odd years ago. But at that point, there really wasn't enough of it, right? And so I personally started a multicultural theater company back then, and I wrote about shows, plays that were, and brought a play from Cuba that were designed to try to bring more of that international or cultural diversity to the stage. And then that sort of ended up echoing in some of the TV shows that I made, like Heart of the Annex and The Film Student. The Film Student was even nominated for being a multicultural television series in the Gemini Awards. And so it was part of our thing was to really highlight all of this exceptional beauty and difference and sameness in Toronto, because we're such a diverse city. I mean, we're like the great thing about Toronto, and I've been really lucky because I've had the fortunate opportunity to travel, and this was done because I went and worked abroad, and I would get a job working on a farm and tried to live elsewhere. And the sole purpose was for me to try and see as much of the world as I possibly could. And I can't tell you what a difference that makes in meeting people today when they say to me, I'm from Egypt, and I'm like, I've been there. I'm from Africa. I've been, I've been to Uganda. I can't tell you the sort of what it does and how that opens up, and in terms of your relationship with them. But I don't feel that you need to get on a plane to do that. You can go to a restaurant and try different food, try something different, watch a movie that's from a different country, make something that speaks about who you are and where you come from in terms of your identity. And that can be socioeconomic as well, or sexual orientation, or whatever it is. But speak about yourself so that we can understand you, and have the courage to do that, and also seek out what others' lived experiences are. Just before there was a close friend of mine who's Korean, and I've known him for 30 odd years. And I went out for lunch with him and another Korean friend of ours, and they started speaking about what they went through, and some of the racism they went through. And I've known him for over 30 years. I've never heard these stories.
Right.
And it really, just the simple thought of, I used to be afraid to bring kimchi to school because it smelled, and people would make fun of me. And I sit in my kitchen, I have a jar of kimchi the size of like an air conditioning unit, because I love it. But it takes time. You got to learn what other foods are about, and then you experience a culture differently. And you hear these stories. It's so important to share them with one another. That's how I think we're going to learn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Hart. I wanted to actually ask Andrew, because you've very much taken the work that you've done in co-founding the Asian Canadian Film Alliance to specifically address the ways in which people of Asian origin are portrayed in media and entertainment. Are you able to please share with us maybe some things about that you've, some insights that might be helpful for us?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I started the Asian Canadian Film Alliance with my sister Melanie, who's also a director, and the reason is because we've been working in the industry for a long time, and we felt like there was, obviously a complete lack of representation of Asian Canadians. So, it's always been a huge part of my work. It's actually what sparked me to become a filmmaker. The fact that I wasn't seeing myself on screen, I don't think if I didn't feel that way, I probably wouldn't have pursued this career. I felt like, because I had been one of those armchair critics that would always complain that there wasn't enough people of Asian descent on screen in Canada and the US, and I finally just took it up myself and decided that I will do something about it, and that's what made me want to become a filmmaker. So all my films have representation of all types of communities, predominantly Asian Canadian, of course, and toiling away for so many years, I just felt like the changes were not happening, or happening very, very slowly, right? And what really sparked the creation of the ACFA was the controversy that surrounded Kim's Convenience, right? About who has the right to tell the stories, right? So and a big part of it is opportunity, right? Like, opportunities have to be created for those whose stories are being told, right? Like, so our mandate is to try to encourage that, for one, through these discussions, and for two, to really nurture and mentor young filmmakers, right? Like, I'm at a stage where I'm mid-career, where I feel like I have a responsibility to mentor others, and hopefully they don't have to face the same barriers that I have, right? And I think it's happening. It's definitely happening. But I still feel like there's just huge systemic barriers in the Canadian film industry that we haven't been able to overcome, that organizations like ours, and there's so many others too,
Right,
of
course.
all different communities that we're doing the work that we are to break down those walls. And I wanted to mention, like, I don't know if I'm getting ahead of myself with the Q&A. There's a point made by Andrew, I see here, that
Yeah, Andrew, for your check.
yeah, so about like the bullying could be is it an offshoot of race, or is it something else? But I think they're kind of inextricable from one another. I think, like, the perceptions, and this is where perceptions and bias like run so deep, right? Like, I think the East Asian community especially, like, for so long have been perceived as a community that will not fight back, that will not retaliate, and that stereotypically is submissive, right? So we are often the target of being bullied, right?
Right.
Like, from a personal level to a community level, right? We're always the community that is the racism is acceptable, right? And it's you'll see it in mass media, right? And it's because they don't fear the same kind of retaliation that they would receive from other communities. But because we've been receiving it at such a high rate since the pandemic has begun, you're seeing us finally fight back. And it's from a cultural level too, that we were taught growing up to not speak up and to just put down our heads and work, and then just do what you're told to get ahead, and you'll survive, right? But we can see now that for second generation Asian Canadians, that it's just not a sustainable way to live, because we're going to continue to experience that hate, and unless we stand up for ourselves, it's going to continue to happen. So I think that definitely plays a part in us being targeted. And that's why, even on a conscious level from these people, it might not necessarily be that, oh, they're Asian, but when you step into a conversation with somebody of Asian descent, you might feel like they're easier to bully, right? Just like when you see, everybody makes those assessments when they choose to get into a confrontation with somebody. They'll be like, how many people are there? How tall is this person? How large? So I think those unconscious biases are happening when they see an Asian person. Like, oh, this is somebody I can easily, like, say something to. They're not going to say anything back. They're just going to walk away. And then, so when I stood up for myself, that obviously surprised them, and then they, they stepped up to us. So I think, when we talk about racial perceptions and racism, it's inextricable from, like, that bullying, right? Like, without those, if those biases didn't happen, then we wouldn't be experiencing that, right? So so that's what I would say. But to get back to your question, like the ACFA we created to kind of make systemic changes in the industry, because I think those biases definitely do exist in our industry. And we felt that as well, that just related to that, the reason why Asian Canadians, being that we are the largest visible minority in Canada, and we have not experienced representation in Canadian media for so long, was because we allowed it to happen to some extent, because we did not speak up, right? And when you don't speak up, you're not going to get that representation. So I think it's important for us to speak up and say that, no, we're not happy with the lack of representation, and we need our stories told. When we make up 10%, at least 10% of the Canadian population, we are a large part of the Canadian fabric, and our stories deserve to be told, and they need to be told.
100%.
So that's how we felt about it when we started our organization.
Thank you so much. And, thank you to your organization and so many organizations in the industry that are pushing this dial to promote more equitable representation and opportunities. I'm loving the chat as well. Thank you so much. It's been honestly one of the best discussions I've ever seen in any webinar I've hosted, and I'm actually going to go through it afterwards. But I want to hand it over to Sura, actually. If you have any examples, I know you are also really active in different equity and diversity and inclusion committees, not just only at Yorkville University, but elsewhere. And if you wanted to share a couple of thoughts with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Yeah, so personally speaking, I'm a huge advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion. I myself am a part of various committees, including my alma mater at Algonquin College, and currently at the place where I'm working at as well. And I oftentimes have messages of people reaching out to me on social media saying, how did you do it? How are you someone that wears a hijab and you're a visible minority? How did you make it to these big companies where we think that they don't accept others? And my tip is that the world is changing. Companies are more accepting of accepting others from every diverse background. And like Hart mentioned, I think it's kind of putting yourself out there and showing people that you, just because you're different doesn't mean that being different is bad. Sometimes being different can be good. Also, I am a huge advocate for supporting orphans, and in supporting my mom's charity, which we've been running for about 15 years now, here outside of Ottawa. It's been wonderful to support disadvantaged families back in Iraq. That's something that not a lot of people know about here. And it's been wonderful to give back to my family's community as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for showing those examples. I actually want to just highlight something in the comments from our VP in BC of the BC campus at Yorkville University, Iman Nasser. It's sad because her comment, it hits hard because, she also is a brilliant woman who, similar to Surah and I, wears the hijab. And she mentioned that it's very hard when racist comments come from people of authority. I was once told by a professor of mine, the world would be a better place is better without your headscarf. So I'm really sorry as well, Iman, that you experienced that. And it's it's really unfortunate because there are those really audacious comments that people will make like that, and it's shocking. Even though I felt it more on a subtle level, the fact that somebody would have the audacity to say that to you is unbelievable. And I think really, just like Ismail is saying in the comments, it's sad to hear that coming from a professor. And that's exactly why we're having these conversations. Whether it's in the higher ed industry, business, or creative industries, we have so much work to do. Glenda McFarland is saying the same thing, that we have a lot of work to do. And I want to thank all of our amazing panelists and all of you for attending as well. I really appreciate it. I just want to quickly actually share some resources. And Yazan, if you're able to please sort of just drop those in the chat as well. These are some resources that will help us out going forward. If you want to check out any of these related to the Government of Canada and what they're doing to address anti-Asian racism, some of the summits, national summits that they've had on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We have Eliminate Hate, which is an organization dedicated primarily to raising awareness about anti-Asian racism. We have Andrew's organization, the Asian Canadian Film Alliance, so definitely recommend checking that out, please. There's FAST, which is Fighting Anti-Semitism Together. And then at the end, we've got the National Council of Canadian Muslims, which does a lot of advocacy work, a lot of great work around raising awareness, not only just about Islamophobia, but about a lot of the other religious intolerance and hate that exists towards other communities and other faith communities as well. I know just before we were starting this webinar, Hart had mentioned the extremely horrific sort of incident that just happened very recently to the NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, I believe in Peterborough. And so I think it's constant, and it is something that we have to keep on top of in terms of having these conversations. And I also want to thank Yorkville University and Toronto Film School as well for their support and their commitment to having these conversations and facilitating these safe spaces. So thank you so much, Andrew, Hart, and Surah, for sharing with us. I think this has been a super powerful discussion, and I want to thank each and every one of the attendees. This chat has just been on fire. Like, I'm literally going to save this and go and read this afterwards, because I think there's so much nuggets of information and a lot of resources that I've seen people sharing as well. Mercedes, I saw you as well, talking a lot about different experiences and how to rephrase comments around where people are from. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it. And this will certainly be posted online as well. You can share it. I know Muhammad Abu Zaina is saying we need part 2. Absolutely. I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you, Melly. Thank you, everybody, for all of your amazing comments and questions and participation. It's been phenomenal. Really, really appreciate it. And
Thank you so much,
much,
Tamina, for having us.
Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you to Yazan behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you,
appreciated it.
Yazan.
Thank you.
I have to say just before we go that
Sure.
since Tamina has come aboard this organization, I have learned so much from you. And I know I expressed that to you in an email, but thank you so much. It really does help to be able to learn from someone with all of your experience and share that with all of our students and faculty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I can see in the chat, we've got our wonderful other members of our diversity advisory councils like Ingrid as well. So I want to give a shout out to everyone and thank you so much to everybody for just being a part of this conversation. Thank you, Jordan. You're now you're just flattering me. So thank you so much. Take care and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
everyone.
Thank you for
Bye.
coming.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
You.